When the news broke that Adolf Hitler was dead, the heart of Germany seemed to stop beating. It was April 30th, 1945, a date that would shatter illusions, destroy dreams, and begin one of the darkest reckonings in history. Inside Berlin, the once proud capital of the Third Reich, silence replaced the thunder of artillery. Smoke drifted between the skeletal ruins of the city, the air thick with dust, ash, and the ghostly echoes of the Führer's final words. But outside the bunkers, far from the marble corridors of power, another story began to unfold, one written on the faces of millions of German women who suddenly found themselves unprotected, leaderless, and prey to the chaos that followed. In the 48 hours after Hitler's death, Germany ceased to exist as a nation. There was no government, no law, and no order, only scattered pockets of soldiers still fighting battles they had already lost. The radio broadcasts that once carried the voice of propaganda now hissed static. Streets, once filled with parades and flags, now reeked of fear and death. For countless women, wives, widows, nurses, and mothers, the news did not bring relief. It brought dread. They knew what came next. The Soviet Red Army was already inside Berlin, and the stories spreading ahead of them were filled with horror. Villages to the east had already fallen, and women whispered in fear of what the Russians did to those who surrendered. Many had clung to the hope that Hitler's death might end the war quickly, that his suicide would signal surrender and perhaps mercy. But instead, the violence intensified. Soviet soldiers, driven by revenge for the millions their people had lost, unleashed their fury on the German population. In those 2 days after Hitler's death, the collapse of civilization became absolute. German women who had spent years believing in Nazi promises of protection now faced the brutal consequences of the war their nation had begun. Inside the ruins of Berlin, women sought refuge in basements, subway tunnels, and bomb shelters. Entire families huddled together in the dark, waiting for the sounds of boots above them to fade. The streets were ruled by soldiers and scavengers. Young girls, some barely in their teens, were told by their mothers to smear themselves with dirt and ashes, to appear older or diseased. Others cut their hair short or disguised themselves as old women. But nothing could stop what was coming. In the hours following Hitler's death, Soviet troops began sweeping through neighborhoods, searching houses for snipers, weapons, and food. But they took more than that. In many places, soldiers dragged women from cellars and basements. Some were assaulted in front of their families, others were taken away and never returned. The psychological collapse was as devastating as the physical destruction. The moral world that had defined these women, loyalty to the Führer, the dream of the Reich, the illusion of superiority, had vanished overnight. There were also those who refused to believe the Führer was gone. In scattered, bombed-out apartments, small radios crackled with rumors that Hitler had escaped to the Alps, that he was regrouping the army for a final stand, that the Soviet reports were lies. Some women, indoctrinated to the end, kept his portrait hanging proudly on the wall, even as Red Army soldiers burst through their doors. Others tore those same portraits down, desperate to hide any sign of loyalty that might bring punishment. For the first time, the women of Germany were forced to face what their country had done. But there was no time for reflection. Survival came first. Outside Berlin, in smaller towns and villages across East Prussia and Silesia, the scene was no different. Streams of refugees, most of them women and children, flooded the roads, pulling carts filled with whatever remained of their lives. They passed burned farms, shattered bridges, and endless columns of prisoners. Soviet aircraft strafed the roads, mistaking civilians for retreating soldiers. Along these paths, tens of thousands of women faced starvation, assault, and disease. The Wehrmacht had promised to defend them. Now, those soldiers were either dead, captured, or had abandoned their uniforms and fled into the forests. Within the first 2 days after Hitler's death, many German women realized the old world was gone forever. The soldiers they once welcomed with flowers were now hunted or executed. The swastika flags that once symbolized unity and pride now marked their homes for vengeance. Some tried to flee westward, toward the advancing American and British lines, believing they would be treated more humanely. Others stayed behind, too weak or too afraid to run. In the ruins of Berlin, one could still hear faint cries of loyalty to the Führer, even after the radio announced his death. fanatical members of the Hitler Youth roamed the streets with pistols, shouting that the Führer was still alive and that traitors would pay. But their voices soon faded under the weight of reality. In the Chancellery bunker, Eva Braun's perfume still lingered in the air as Soviet soldiers discovered their charred bodies. Above ground, the city reeked of gasoline, blood, and fear. For the women hiding nearby, the smell meant only one thing: the end. Neighbors who had once betrayed each other to the Gestapo now clung together for safety. They shared food, whispered prayers, and burned Nazi uniforms to keep warm. The sudden absence of authority created a vacuum where human instinct, both kind and cruel, took control. Some men turned to looting. Some women traded jewelry or their bodies for food. Others simply sat in silence, unable to process the collapse of everything they had believed in. Among the most haunting images of those 48 hours were the women of Berlin walking through the rubble, heads down, faces blank, carrying buckets of water from shattered hydrants. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical. They were ghosts moving through the remains of a dream that had devoured them. The myth of the Aryan paradise was gone, replaced by a waking nightmare. The victors did not distinguish between loyal Nazis and ordinary citizens. To them, all were guilty, and many women paid the price for crimes they never committed. By the evening of May 1st, 1945, the word had spread across the shattered nation. Hitler was dead, his body burned, his empire finished. Some women wept. Others laughed hysterically, unable to understand their own emotions. A few took their own lives, swallowing poison or jumping into the Spree River. Suicide had become a final act of control, the last decision they could make in a world where everything else had been taken from them. In the smouldering ruins of Berlin, life had not yet begun to rebuild. Every wall, every shadow, every face bore the same unspoken question: what happens now? And though none could answer, one truth had already settled deep in their bones. The death of Hitler was not the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning of what history would later call the reckoning of German women in the days immediately following Hitler's death. The nightmare that German women had feared most became reality. Soviet troops, fueled by rage and loss, poured into Berlin and across the eastern provinces. Their vengeance was not aimed at soldiers, but at symbols of the Reich, and in their eyes, every German woman had become one. The Soviet command had issued orders to maintain discipline, but on the ground, chaos reigned. What happened in those first 48 hours after the Führer's suicide multiplied in the following days into an epidemic of horror. For women, there was no refuge, no law, and no protection. The streets that once echoed with patriotic marches now pulsed with screams and the heavy boots of occupying soldiers. In one Berlin apartment block, a young woman named Margarete hid in a coal cellar with her mother and sister. They had survived weeks of bombardment, rationed their last food, and whispered prayers each night. When the Red Army reached their neighborhood, the doors splintered open one by one. Soviet soldiers stormed through, searching for valuables and women. The cries from the floors above drifted down through the ceiling. Margarete's mother covered her daughter's ears, but the sounds pierced through everything. Hours later, when silence returned, they emerged into a new kind of world. Their home was gone, their neighbors broken, and the men of the house, her father and brother, missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. These stories were not isolated. They repeated themselves in village after village, city after city. German women, many of whom had once celebrated the expansion of the Reich, now felt the full weight of its collapse. The Red Army's fury was not only revenge, it was a declaration that Germany's illusions of superiority and purity had died with its leader. Some Soviet soldiers wept as they remembered their own families killed in the war, but many more were consumed by hatred. To them, every German was responsible for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for the burned villages of the East. The women they encountered became the outlet for that fury. Yet amid this chaos, acts of humanity still appeared. Some Soviet officers tried to protect civilians under their command. A few punished their own men for violence. But those moments were rare, drowned out by the scale of destruction. German women learned quickly that survival required silence, caution, and a kind of emotional numbness that would last for years. Mothers taught daughters to hide when soldiers came, to look down, to not speak unless spoken to. Others disguised themselves as nurses or claimed to be foreign workers. In some areas, women carried signs reading typhus, a desperate warning meant to keep intruders away. For many, the humiliation was followed by something even worse: shame and isolation. Neighbors who once shared food now avoided each other, afraid of the memories they carried. Women who had been assaulted often stayed silent, believing no one would understand or forgive them. In post-war Germany, these crimes were rarely spoken of, even decades later. Survivors referred to them only as what happened. The emotional trauma became an invisible scar, passed down quietly, teased through generations. Meanwhile, the official German surrender had not yet come. In the countryside, rumors spread faster than truth. Some women still believed Hitler was alive, that the Wehrmacht was regrouping, that salvation would come. Others had abandoned faith in everything. Churches filled with refugees seeking comfort. Priests preached endurance, but their words fell hollow in the shadow of what was unfolding. In some parishes, entire groups of women took their own lives rather than face what they knew awaited them when the Soviets arrived. Rivers across eastern Germany carried bodies, mothers, daughters, grandmothers, all victims of despair. By May 2nd, Berlin officially fell. Red flags were hoisted over the Reichstag, and the city's last defenders laid down their weapons. The city was divided into zones of occupation, but control was still far from organized. Soviet soldiers roamed freely, taking whatever they desired. Women lined up at makeshift soup stations run by surviving Germans and a few sympathetic Russians. Hunger replaced fear, and barter replaced money. Wedding rings were traded for bread, shoes for safety. A strange new economy was born out of defeat, and in this new reality, alliances began to shift. Some German women formed fragile connections with Soviet soldiers, trading companionship for protection or food. It was not love. Often it was a kind of survival pact. Historians later described these relationships as complex, but to those living them there was nothing abstract about it. A loaf of bread could save a family. A soldier's favor could mean safety for a night. Yet such choices brought judgment. Other women looked upon them as traitors, collaborators with the enemy. But in truth, no one could judge anyone anymore. Survival had stripped away morality, pride, and identity. As days turned into weeks, the emotional landscape of Germany transformed. The pride that had once filled propaganda posters was replaced by silence and guilt. For years, the Nazi regime had portrayed German women as symbols of purity and loyalty, the guardians of the nation. Now they were symbols of its collapse, witnesses to the empire's crimes, victims of its downfall, and bearers of its shame. In every town, women were forced to navigate the impossible question: how to live after everything had been destroyed, including the meaning of being German. Some tried to rebuild what they could. They cleaned streets, reopened schools, nursed the wounded. The Red Army eventually imposed order, but the scars were permanent. The women who had endured the violence were never the same. They became the silent backbone of a broken country, tasked with feeding families, burying the dead, and pretending life could continue. They rebuilt walls but avoided eye contact, carried on conversations without mentioning the past. The psychological silence became a second war, one fought within their own minds. And while the Soviet soldiers celebrated victory in Berlin, German women sat in the ruins, holding the last remnants of their lives. The world saw the fall of Nazism as justice. They experienced it as devastation. For them, Hitler's death was not a liberation. It was the erasure of everything familiar. The Reich had promised them belonging, protection, and purpose. Now, in its ashes, they had none of those things left. Only fear, hunger, and the slow realization that their suffering was far from over. As night fell on the third day after Hitler's death, the city of Berlin glowed faintly with the fires of the conquered. Soviet music played from makeshift S. And as the sun set on that second day after the Führer's death, the sounds of celebration echoed faintly from the Soviet lines. The war was ending, but for German women, a new kind of battle had just begun, one for dignity, for survival, and for memory. The empire they had lived under had promised them glory. What it left them instead was ruin, shame, and the long, cold silence of defeat. Pikers in the streets. And among the ruins, German women lay awake, listening, not to speeches or commands this time, but to the heavy silence that followed history's most violent collapse. For them, the war did not end on May 8 with Germany's surrender. It ended much later, when the echoes finally faded and they could whisper again without fear. But that would take years. For now, they could only wait in the darkness, mourning not just their lost nation, but the shattered pieces of themselves. By the third day after Hitler's death, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a wound. Smoke curled from the ruins, mingling with the cold May air. The Reich had fallen, but the violence had not. Soviet troops filled the streets like a tide that would not recede, and among the broken buildings, German women moved like shadows, slow, silent, and hollow-eyed. For them, there was no liberation, no victory, only survival. The once proud capital of the Nazi Empire had become a graveyard of ideals, and in that graveyard, women carried the weight of both guilt and punishment. In every district, the Red Army's occupation grew more organized, but the scars of the first few days remained. Soviet officers established headquarters in abandoned schools and government buildings, while soldiers patrolled the streets, their eyes always watching. Posters appeared on walls in Russian and broken German announcing that the war was over and looting was forbidden. Yet in the cellars beneath those posters, women still hid, unable to believe that anything was truly forbidden anymore. The lines between soldier and victim had blurred completely. Many German men had either been killed in battle or taken prisoner, leaving women to navigate this shattered landscape alone. Widows, mothers, and daughters carried on without guidance, without leadership. The same propaganda that once glorified their strength now meant nothing. The ideology of the German woman, the loyal mother, the supporter of her soldier husband, the pure symbol of the nation, was dead. In its place stood real women, starving, terrified, and stripped of everything but endurance. They were no longer symbols, they were survivors. Food became the new currency. Every morning women gathered at burned-out marketplaces, trading whatever scraps they could find. A wedding dress might be exchanged for a loaf of bread, a child's toy for a few potatoes. Those who had managed to preserve their dignity were forced to confront a new kind of shame, begging, bartering, and relying on the mercy of the very men who had conquered them. Some soldiers shared their rations, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes out of darker motives. For many women, these small exchanges were the difference between life and death. Among the rubble, makeshift hospitals sprang up, run by German nurses under Soviet supervision. The smell of disinfectant could not mask the stench of decay. In the wards lay the wounded, the sick, and the assaulted. Doctors worked with trembling hands, treating injuries they could not name in their reports. The psychological toll was immense. In whispered voices, women began to share their experiences. But even in those conversations, shame was stronger than words. The war had silenced them in ways no weapon ever could. Yet amid the despair, strange alliances began to form. Some Soviet soldiers, young and far from home, started protecting the very people they had once viewed as enemies. They shared cigarettes, exchanged photographs of their families, even helped rebuild homes. For a few German women, these connections offered a fragile sense of humanity, a reminder that beneath the uniforms and flags, people were still capable of kindness. But such moments were fleeting. The chaos of war had broken something deeper than walls. It had shattered trust. In the countryside, beyond Berlin's ruins, entire columns of refugees still wandered westward, desperate to reach the American or British zones. They moved through mud and wreckage, clutching children and bundles of clothes. Soviet patrols intercepted many of them, sending them back or stripping them of what little they had left. For these women, each sunrise brought a new terror. Some were attacked on the road, others disappeared into makeshift camps. There was no law, no safety, and no one to appeal to. Inside Berlin, suicides continued. Every morning, neighbors found bodies hanging in stairwells, floating in rivers, or slumped in corners. Cyanide pills, once distributed by the Nazi regime as an honorable escape, were now a tragic currency of despair. Women who had once believed in Hitler's promise of greatness could not face the humiliation of defeat. Others took their children with them, believing death was the only way to spare them. It was as if the entire city had stopped believing in tomorrow. And yet, in the midst of this hell, life began to flicker again. The Red Army organized cleanup crews, many of them composed of women. They cleared rubble, buried the dead, and began restoring electricity. Slowly, order began to return, but it was an order imposed by the victors, not one born from the people. Every action, every breath was watched. The women of Berlin were required to serve in whatever ways the occupation demanded: cleaning, nursing, cooking. Some did so willingly, simply to feel useful again. Others did it because refusal meant punishment. The psychological contrast was unbearable. Just days earlier, these same women had been the pride of the Reich, part of a nation that believed it ruled the world. Now they were subjects of pity or contempt. Their husbands were gone, their leaders dead, their country erased from the map. The German language itself carried the weight of defeat. Every phrase sounded like confession. Every silence felt like guilt. Among them, a young woman named Ilse wrote in her diary, "I don't know what day it is. The sky is grey, and the streets smell of smoke and fear. A Russian soldier gave me bread today. I thanked him, but inside I wanted to cry. We are all ghosts now. The war ended, but something worse remains." Her words reflected the truth that millions of women felt but could not speak aloud. The enemy was no longer outside. It lived inside their memories, in every sound, every knock on the door, every shadow that reminded them of what they had lost. Over time, the occupying soldiers grew bored, restless, and drunk. They celebrated victory with loud music, laughter, and vodka, while the women huddled in silence just a few streets away. The war had given them nothing to celebrate. When Soviet officers finally began enforcing discipline more strictly, it was already too late for many. The damage had been done, and the shame would last for generations. By the end of the first week after Hitler's death, Berlin began to resemble something alive again. Smoke still rose, but the gunfire had quieted. The Red Army declared victory, and a fragile calm settled over the ruins, but beneath that calm, a quiet despair endured. German women began to look at each other differently, not as rivals, not as followers of a failed cause, but as survivors of something unspeakable. They shared glances that said everything words could not. As night fell once more over the ruined city, the fires dimmed, and the streets grew quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a Soviet soldier played an accordion. The tune drifted through the rubble, strange and haunting. In the darkened apartments, German women lay awake, listening, not to the song but to the echo of history, closing a chapter it would never fully explain. The Reich was dead. Hitler was gone. But the silence of those who survived would echo longer than any speech or battle cry ever had. By the end of that first week, the illusion of order returned to Berlin, but it was a fragile, uneasy order built on fear. The Soviet administration began establishing control block by block, street by street. Red Army guards stood outside government buildings now draped with Soviet banners. Patrols roamed the ruins, enforcing new rules in a city that no longer had any laws of its own. Loudspeakers announced curfews, ration schedules, and the beginning of what they called denazification. But beneath these official measures, the real struggle was not political. It was human. For the women of Germany, the battle had shifted from surviving war to surviving peace. Everywhere, the scars of conquest were visible. Women moved quietly through the streets, their eyes lowered, carrying buckets for water or sacks of coal. The streets were littered with burned-out vehicles and the twisted metal of what had once been tanks. The air still carried the bitter smell of smoke and blood. But now, there was also another scent, decay, both physical and moral. In every ruined apartment block, stories circulated of the young wife who vanished after soldiers came knocking, of the mother who poisoned her children, of the neighbor who betrayed someone to the Soviets to save herself. Berlin had become a city of whispers, a place where no one dared to ask questions, and no one wanted to answer them. The women who had endured the first days of occupation were no longer the same. Some carried themselves with quiet defiance, refusing to break even after everything. Others drifted through the ruins like ghosts, their minds trapped in the horrors they had seen. The few men who remained, old soldiers, amputees, and the elderly, watched helplessly as women took on the burdens of rebuilding life from ashes. The gender roles that had once defined Nazi Germany collapsed overnight. The women became the LA. Borers, the scavengers, the caretakers of the dead. Food shortages worsened. The Soviets controlled every supply depot, and rations were distributed unevenly. Those with connections to the occupying forces fared slightly better, the rest went hungry. Barter became the only economy that worked. Some women exchanged family heirlooms for bread or medicine. Others offered companionship to soldiers in exchange for food, a desperate transaction that blurred the line between survival and humiliation. It wasn't spoken of openly, but everyone knew it was happening. It had become part of life in the ruins. Amid the devastation, churches began reopening their doors. Women gathered in small groups to pray, not for victory or ideology, but for forgiveness and strength. The sermons were quiet, the hymns broken, but the faith that emerged was raw and real. For many, religion became the only anchor left. They prayed for lost husbands and sons, for children taken to camps, for an end to the endless night that had followed the Führer's death. Yet even inside the sanctuaries, the shadow of shame lingered. Some women avoided confession, unable to speak of what had been done to them or what they had done. To survive. In one church on Alexanderplatz, a young nurse named Lotte volunteered to help the wounded. She was 23, with eyes that seemed much older. She moved silently between cots, cleaning wounds with water from the Spree River. Soviet officers sometimes visited the makeshift hospital, offering supplies or inspecting the work. Lotte avoided their gaze, speaking only when necessary. But one officer, a man named Victor, began leaving small gifts, a piece of bread, a candle, once even a red scarf. It was unclear whether it was kindness, guilt, or desire. Lotte accepted these things quietly, understanding that in this new world everything came with a price. Beyond the city, the countryside was a wasteland. Farms lay abandoned, fields burned, and livestock slaughtered. Refugees returned to find their homes looted or occupied. Entire communities had vanished, erased by bombs or retreating armies. German women in rural areas faced the same horrors as those in the cities, but without even the pretense of law. Soviet patrols moved from village to village, often drunk, taking what they wanted. Some officers tried to stop it, but they too were exhausted. Many had fought from Stahl. Ingrad to Berlin without rest. Their discipline was frayed, their humanity battered by 4 years of unimaginable loss. Meanwhile, the radio began to speak again. The new German broadcasts under Soviet supervision declared that Hitler's suicide had freed the people from tyranny, that Germany would be rebuilt under a new peaceful order. But for the women listening in their half-collapsed apartments, those words felt hollow. They did not feel free, they felt broken. Every sound of Russian speech reminded them of what they had endured. And yet, for the first time in years, there was no Nazi propaganda, no orders shouted through megaphones, only silence, and in that silence, the faint beginning of truth. Many began asking questions they had never dared to before. What had all the suffering been for? What had their husbands and sons really died defending? Why had they believed in a man who left them to face this? For the first time, German women began to see themselves not just as victims of war, but as witnesses to the crimes of their own nation. The denial that had kept them loyal for so long began to crumble. They saw the Jewish survivors emerging from camps, the skeletal faces, the tattooed arms. The propaganda had said those were lies, but the truth now walked among them, silent and alive. This realization brought a new kind of pain, moral pain. The war's physical violence could heal with time, but the guilt of complicity cut deeper. Some women tried to atone through work, volunteering in hospitals, feeding orphans, cleaning the streets. Others shut down emotionally, unable to process what their country had done and what they had suffered in return. The contrast was unbearable, both the aggressor and the victim, both guilty and destroyed. In the nights that followed, the city remained dimly lit by fires and candles. Music returned in small ways, an accordion in a courtyard, a piano rescued from a ruined home. The notes sounded fragile, uncertain, like a wounded animal's cry. Yet they reminded people that life somehow continued. Even in the face of ruin, the human instinct to rebuild was stronger than despair. By the time May 8 arrived, Germany's formal surrender, the women of Berlin had already lived through their own private apocalypse. They no longer believed in the promises of men, armies, or ideologies. They believed only in endurance. The war had taken ever. Thing. homes, husbands, children, dignity, but it had also stripped away illusion. What remained was raw humanity, bare and unadorned. As the Red Army celebrated Victory Day, fireworks lit the night sky above the city they had conquered. To the soldiers, it was a symbol of triumph. To the German women watching from the ruins, it was something else entirely. A cruel reflection of what had once been theirs. Pride, hope, a sense of belonging. Now, as the lights flickered above them, they stood quietly among the debris, their faces pale in the glow. There was no applause, no singing, no celebration. Only the distant echo of explosions that felt far too familiar. In that moment, Berlin stood suspended between two worlds, the past that had burned and the future that had not yet begun. And at the center of it all were the women, silent and enduring, carrying a grief that would not fade for generations. The empire had died with its leader, but the ghosts it left behind still wandered through the rubble, whispering of things that could never be undone. In the weeks that followed the fall of Berlin, time seemed to lose its meaning. Days bled into nights, and the city remained a wasteland of stow. The propaganda of purity, the dream of a 1,000-year empire, the pride of the Aryan race, all of it had ended in rubble. What remained were the women who had lived through it, scarred but breathing, haunted but unbroken. They had seen the rise and fall of the most powerful regime in modern history, and now they were left to carry the burden of its ashes. The war had turned them into witnesses, not heroes. Their survival itself became an act of defiance. Smoke, and silence. Hitler's death had ended the war in name, but for the German women who survived, the real war had only just begun. A war of memory, guilt, and endurance. The guns had fallen silent, yet every street, every wall, every echo still carried the voices of what had happened. For the first time in 12 years there were no swastikas, no parades, no Führer's speeches, only the fragile hum of life struggling to begin again. The Soviets began reorganizing Berlin into zones of control. Administration buildings were cleared, propaganda posters replaced with red banners and portraits of Stalin. German women were ordered to return to work, clearing rubble, cooking for occupation troops, nursing the wounded, and burying the countless dead that still lay beneath the ruins. The task seemed endless. Piles of bricks lined every street. The city was a graveyard being forced to come back to life. They became known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Their hands were raw, their bodies frail, but they worked tirelessly, piece by piece, rebuilding what the war had annihilated. The world saw them as symbols of resilience, but behind their quiet strength was exhaustion and despair. Many had lost everything: husbands at the front, children in air raids, families scattered across occupied territories. And yet they lifted stones, cleared glass, and swept ashes from the streets as if to bury their grief beneath the dust. It was their way of fighting back, of reclaiming a fragment of dignity in a world that had taken it from them. Food remained scarce. The Red Army controlled every warehouse and distribution point, and hunger became a constant companion. People ate whatever they could find: rats, weeds, old flour traded on the black market. Disease spread through the ruins, and many of the old and sick simply didn't wake up. Yet amid the deprivation, a quiet order began to take shape. Soviet officers began enforcing stricter discipline on their troops, punishing looting and violence. The terror of those first nights slowly subsided, replaced by a colder, more structured occupation. But inside the homes, another kind of silence took root. The silence of things that could not be spoken. Mothers avoided questions from their children about where their fathers were, or why they had followed a man who destroyed their country. Women who had been assaulted avoided each other's eyes. Entire neighborhoods lived in mutual understanding without words. Everyone had lost something, and no one wanted to remember. In that collective forgetting, the first outlines of post-war Germany began to form, a nation that would bury its guilt beneath the need to survive. The churches filled once more, not with faith in ideology, but in desperation. Candles burned before cracked altars as women prayed not for victory but for forgiveness. The words came haltingly, as if they feared being heard by the past. In their prayers there was no mention of Hitler or the Reich, only pleas for mercy, for themselves, for their dead, for the children who would inherit what was left. For many, faith was not a comfort but a confession whispered into the ruins. Outside, the first signs of renewal appeared. Markets reopened under Soviet supervision. Children scavenged through debris for toys. Women stitched clothes from torn curtains. And from time to time, laughter returned. Thin, uncertain, but real. It was the laughter of people who knew the worst had already happened, who had nothing left to lose. That fragile laughter became the heartbeat of the new Germany being born in the ashes of the old one. For others, there was only silence. Those who had lost too much withdrew from the world entirely. Some wandered the ruins speaking to the dead. Others sat in doorways staring at nothing. The line between the living and the ghosts blurred in those early weeks. Survivors carried invisible wounds that would never heal, and no one came to treat them. Trauma became the air they breathed. In the Soviet command centers, officers prepared reports for Moscow, order restored in Berlin. Civilian cooperation improving. But the women sweeping the streets knew better. They knew that beneath every stone they lifted lay the bones of the old Germany, its arrogance, its crimes, and its illusions. The new world could be built on the same soil, but not without the echoes of what had been buried there. As the weeks turned to months, the Allied forces divided Germany into 4 zones. The Americans and British entered their territories, bringing food, medicine, and a different kind of occupation. More structured, less vengeful. News spread that the Nuremberg trials would begin, that the world would finally judge what Germany had done. But for the women who had survived Berlin's fall, judgment had already come and gone. They did not need a courtroom to know guilt. They lived with it every day, in their hunger, in their silence, in the eyes of their children. Some tried to write their stories, but most stayed quiet. History would forget their names, even as it remembered the men who caused their suffering. Decades later, historians would call them the lost women, their trauma too uncomfortable to discuss, their voices erased from the official narrative. But in 1945, they did not think of history. They thought only of tomorrow, of rebuilding one more wall, of finding one more loaf of bread, of keeping one more child alive. By late summer, green shoots began to appear through the cracks of the bombed streets. Life, stubborn and defiant, was returning. Children played among the ruins, chasing each other through burned-out tramcars. The same streets that had once echoed with Hitler's parades now carried the faint sound of hope. It was not triumph, not redemption, just survival. And yet, even as the city began to heal, a question haunted every survivor. How could they ever atone for what had been done in their name? Some answered by rebuilding, by working harder, by caring for those left behind. Others carried the question in silence to their graves. The rubble women built new walls, but inside the cracks remained. The ghosts of those 48 hours after Hitler's death, those 2 days when all order collapsed, never left them. At night, when the fires burned low and the streets fell silent, Berlin seemed to breathe again. The wind carried the faint echo of sirens long gone, of marching boots that would never return, and in the dim light of broken windows, the women who had endured it all sat quietly, watching, remembering, and trying to understand how a nation that promised greatness could end in such ruin. For them, the war would never truly end. It would live on in dreams, in silence, in the way they looked at the world after the smoke cleared. The Reich had died with its leader, but its shadow stretched on, across their memories, across their guilt, across every life it had touched. And though history would move forward, the women of Germany would carry that shadow with them always, as both burden and warning of what happens when humanity forgets its soul.